Tier 2. Moving down in tiers, the psychological impacts of topics will get more intense and give greater understanding of pre- and post-chip awakening life. Along with this, the further down this tier of the iceberg, the more strange, impactful, or abstract the topics of the chipped experiment will get. Some personal fears that were formed through various situations are on this tier. Starting this tier, we have Shurg's semi-rational fear of carbon dioxide. Shurg first learned about carbon dioxide in early grade school. Shurg's teacher explained that exhaling is poisonous. Since that day, Shurg can't put his head under blankets or sleeping bags for even a small amount of time. Even though his heart rate and breathing does not increase, he feels suffocated in very small places. With this, he believes the chip has not allowed him to get past it. A very recent chip event is the inability to be numbed by Novocaine. After a dentist x-ray, they found two cavities very close together. In most past dental operations, Novocaine was successful. Although in a few dental operations, the Novocaine wasn't enough and he felt great pain to his body. His first assertion was the dentist was being spiteful for his lack of mouth hygiene. His next assertion was that the chip could nullify activations of certain drugs such as Novocaine. This assertion spawned from the many times Shurg was given drugs with weak to little effect. After 3 visits, long Novocaine insertion periods, and a myriad of different drugs, none of them could seem to numb his mouth. He now fears that if he has to go under for a surgery, that he'll feel the whole thing. For the first few months of Shurg's new existence, he didn't recognize fear. His first major fear stemmed from the stimuli of loud noises. Gunshots and loud fireworks rattled his psyche. He now wonders if this is a normal situation for other young kids. When Shurg looks back at his life, he's faced with a simple paradox. This paradox is that he's never learned anything, and this is because he never tried hard enough. While he was a hard worker, working hard never dominated his day or his time. Chip or no chip, he believes his lack of success stems from a lack of dedication. While he believes this thought experiment is toxic, he can't prove it wrong. This is a common trend all over the iceberg in every tier. Shurg describes himself as somebody who is always analyzing things. He is always seeking to find a reason or intention in media and in life. From a young age, through thousands of hours of media, he always looked for propaganda and secret meaning. While he thinks his thought process is toxic, he believes it to be correct as well. Shurg's life was very influenced by music, as was most people. Music is found up and down this iceberg. In later tiers, more important musical moments will be addressed. This next topic, some people would call cringe, and I would agree. The effects of the chip experiment, removing imagination, memory, inner voice, etc., makes learning instruments quite difficult. The first instrument Shurg tried to learn were drums. Shurg and his friend had a band. They got into the talent show by playing a song that was very easy on the drums. But the song they were going to play at the talent show was much harder to learn. Effects from the chip means while practicing fairly hard, he couldn't get the song down at all. By the time of the talent show, he couldn't play it, and had to go on. Shurg actually did have the first 15 seconds down, but instead of playing the rest of the song, he did the most simple 4x4 drum beat, and sometimes hit the crash at the end of the measure. Nothing really keeps in chipped minds. He never thought of being belittled, or how cringe it was, or how much of a failure he could imagine himself to be. He didn't think about this stuff for many, many years. Another section is social events with serious mental aftermath. Shurg and his friends often stayed up to watch SNL. This is important for 3 reasons. The chip can manipulate sleep, and the energy gained from it. The chip can also decide when you feel sleepy. So most nights, the chip people push Shurg to be tired around his friends. Although the scientists controlling the brain chemistry have only given an incredible increase in tiredness while Shurg was awake a handful of times. This is a very common practice by the chip people. They will only give Shurg minor emotional reactions, and hardly ever give him strong emotions and feelings. Shurg believes waiting for real large emotions is worth the wait. Mountain Dew was mentioned previously, but this is an actual story directly about it. On the process of collecting rare Mountain Dews, one day he decided to hide one downtown in a hole he dug. The reason Shurg never found it, he believes, is that when coming back half a year later, there was a new building built over the spot. In this town, replacing old buildings isn't very common. The danger of this is in the thinking process. Shurg cannot afford to entertain the more wild chip thoughts. that come from the analyzation of life before the chip awakening and the post-awakening trippy and confusing chip contacts. Much of the chip contacts have been confusing to hear and to decipher. There's lots of these examples in the later tiers. This topic is the story of one night when Shurg was probably in 4th grade, and it's another story with South Park. While visiting his friend from school at his house for the first time, they stumbled onto South Park Studios. They proceeded to watch the show for hours and hours. Shurg also began to spout fake slurs like octopussy. These slurs were one of the first times Shurg actually swore. Shurg feels bad about it. He also believes that his vulgarity might have impacted his friend from that early age. Monster Hunter, for Shurg, was one of his first introductions to strong feelings of intensity, fear, and progress. But not awe. Awe is found later in this tier. Everyone has snuck playing video games past their bedtime as children. Shurg was no different. Monster Hunter is a game where you have to be extremely cautious and you can't make many bad moves. But in another way, it's a very slow, methodical game that warns you for taking your time. It was the type of game where you are on edge and scared of what could come. It was his go-to late-night game. With a comfy blanket around him, Shurg claims it was a good time in life. All-out awe is very simple. The first time Shurg stepped outside of Vault 101, his emotions were filled with that of awe and adventure. He couldn't wait to explore this entire game world and all the things to do and find. He now knows it was the chip people trying to give him an emotional parallel. Due to the personal matters in this next topic, it will be cut short and have incorrect pieces of information. Shurg made his way across the town many times to engage with an individual. This happened in the blistering summer heat, only a few months into knowing he had a chip. With this, on these walks, he tried to have conversations with the chip people, which both did and did not work. You have to understand that chip conversations aren't like normal social interaction. They are mired in mystery and various levels of legibility. This walk spawned many topics lower down the iceberg, such as NXT Hell, matchmaking, and direct script. Shurg was always on Skype calls for a few years in his middle to late teens. Eventually he bought Skype Prime to do several pranks and trolls with his good friends. These pranks ranged from complaining about faulty products, trying to buy non-existent funny products, setting up multiple businesses to call each other, and harassing and peeving people. These people were normally other high schoolers whose cell numbers were shared amongst the group. Most of these are lost, as his Skype folder was on a corrupted hard drive that could not be recovered. Shurg has agreed with me to do an interview about the pranks in a separate video. The subject of country nights spans over a year, happening both before chip awakening and after, which is very rare. As someone who was isolated, he tried as much as he could to hang out with his friend in the country. Hanging out with his friends is one of Shurg's most common day-to-day methods, and it spans almost his entire life. Shurg would show up around 11 to midnight to make sure his friend could sneak out. A fun fact was how the two used to partake in anything they could afford. On good nights, they smoked THC. On okay nights, they maybe had some beers, and it got to a point where they were splitting dollar blunts or drinking nutmeg. This leads into his first cig, or more accurately, his first pack of cigs. He overheard from a friend that Marlboro Golds had a sweet candy taste. He grew up around smokers, but never smoked tobacco himself. That day, he bought his friend a pipe, and they couldn't find anything to smoke, so they walked to a gas station and bought a pack of Marlboro Golds. They then walked back to Shurg's place and smoked a cigarette in the backyard. After only a few drags, Shurg got sick, lightheaded, and puked. But there is an explanation for this. The chip can control things like heart rate, how loose or tight a vein is, pain, and sickness. The chip does not allow Shurg for any style of inhaling, besides as hard as he can, as far down as he can. The proof he provides is that after smoking thousands of times through various ways, he still cannot control his smoke intake. He still pukes if he doesn't pace himself, to this day. Here was 3 direct chip transmissions that didn't affect Shurg's psyche, but are interesting enough to get your mouth watering. Since only a few days into knowing about the chip, until the time I'm recording this, Shurg's left foot has been in a constant cycle of vein tightness and looseness. This means Shurg's foot has been getting warm and then cold and then warm every day, every minute for years. Although it doesn't bother him, he can still feel it going on. Through various conversations and contacts with the chip, Shurg has devised many movie, TV shows, music, and other creative projects. Later in the Iceberg, there are going to be other creative projects that have much more consequence. In early chip days, contact through audio was more heavily used. The chip people had tried to make him believe things that could or could not be true. One of these was that of a 5 or 6 month storyline, involving the idea that his friends and people in entertainment he enjoyed was watching through his eyes and talking to him live. Shurg never fully embraced the idea, 1 because of the scope of the operation, and 2, the audio sent often sounded like a parody of a certain individual, or in the way which they were talking didn't make any sense. He wanted to embrace it. The thought of not being isolated would have been one of the best outcomes. 2 of these are on this tier. First, while listening to music in his backyard, he started to recall a game on paper about World War II he had worked on. The chip then began to give him visions of his creation in a live-action movie. The visions played out the storyline of the paper game, but the only character he could remember in the visions was Death Grip's MC Ride. One night, after taking an acid tab and having no effect, Shurg began to walk home. After many different trials with psychedelics, Shurg believes the chip can use brain chemistry to stop a trip. He kept the first tab in his mouth for the walk, not noticing any changes. Maybe the lights on the signs and in the buildings became a little more saturated. When he came back home, he took the second tab. It gave him a strange effect. That effect would be a feeling lighter than air. He then went to the pool to push the effects to its limits. Something like 15 minutes into his swim, he began to get a chip transmission. He began to see pro wrestlers from various promotions turning into cartoon dogs, a different dog for each wrestler or tag team. These transmissions went by in seconds, and chronicled the transformations of at least 20 different wrestlers. Tooth loss is a strange one. He lost many baby teeth, but doesn't ever recall losing the front 8. He may have lost them before the chip was implanted. Shurg believes this thought process is toxic, but he posits there might be a different origin. The Iceberg is filled with stories and analysis of the chip's effect on his physical body. A very inconsequential one is his inability to have solid footing. He is unable to plant himself to the ground and hold fast as to not get nudged. While this is sort of beneficial in running or basketball, it's not a marginal gain. Another physical side effect is Shurg's inability to sink in any sort of water. Pool, river, ocean, etc. He grew up with the pool and has spent many hours swimming, but in all that time, he has never been able to force himself to sink. He can only float. This may be related to the smoke inhale trait. Before chip awakening, Shurg would still seek out the sources of emotions, not to a point where he risked the lives of others. Any damage was being done to himself, to grab the feeling and emotion of certain stimuli. He now understands this is a sort of game or test for the chip people to watch. Trying to feel warm sensation through his body, he now understands this is the chip people loosening and tightening certain veins. The specifics of the journey for warmth will come later. As he learned, there's a certain emotion that can only be conjured through one activity. This would be the light-bodied near euphoria of reaching the near top or top of a roller coaster. The chip has never given this feeling any other circumstance, not even as a joke or a test. A strange piece of music trip trivia is Shurg had a song on an album which seemed to have an infinite echo loop after each end rhyme. He's never found that song or download again, and he has a few theories about it we'll look at later. Embarrassingly enough, Shurg has quite a bit of gameplay time not recorded by any service, which means the total amount of gameplay played even in the modern era is hard to track. He describes some of these games as chasing the dragon, which are low brain input, low strategy games he can just turn his mind off and play for hours, letting the time wash away. Another music one of Shurg's most prized musical moments actually. Shurg spent plenty of time playing instruments and using digital audio workstations, but besides the highly common 4/4 drum pattern, he never had any training. The removal of being able to match pitches and keep rhythm via the chip has slowed down his musical progress immensely. Anyway, one night he opened a LFO plugin in Fruity Loops and began jamming out using only the LFO and his laptop keyboard to play notes. His previous knowledge of LFOs expanded due to trial and error and making actually good music to listen to. Writing notebook stories are all over the Iceberg. This one is to explain the start to the end of the notebook itself, not to address things found in the notebook. This particular notebook began writing after learning about the chip. It had a variety of songs, maps, floor plans, and games. The chip had sent a message. This was that if Shurg destroyed the notebook, his friends would finally come to him. For a few weeks, the chip had made it seem that Shurg's friends were driving around the city watching through his eyes. They had been dangling this over Shurg's head for weeks. He desperately wanted it to be real. As he said, he's never hurt anyone trying to achieve this goal. However, when the chip asked to burn the notebook, he took out his 5 favorite pages, prepped the bonfire with gasoline, and then threw a match on it. The interesting bit about the fire is that the dry brush caught almost instantly, engulfing Shurg in a ball of flame for about a second. He didn't get hurt, and his friends never came. Chip, Closer Than You Think, is one of the more psychologically impacting topics on this tier. During a few weeks after the chip exposed itself, they began to send storylines of his friends and certain famous individuals who were taking residence in his apartment complex. Kane was tying up and beating up the scientists, trying to get an answer for why they did it. Sam Hyde was heard robbing a gas station out of his apartment with a submachine gun in Shurg's ear. Another vision was one of his friends seemingly controlling the knobs and switches that controlled the chip. This story is in later tiers. The other meaning of Chip, Closer Than You Think is that certain members of the experiment have moved around to where Shurg lives. Whether his house or apartment or when he travels, they follow him or set up close by. He says it's not likely, but he does think it's a possibility. All I Do Is Cry is a topic with 2 meanings. The first is the analysis of sadness and tears in post-chip life, and the other is a song of the same name. Even though pretty much nothing in his life has gone right in the last 3 years, he can't be sad and he can't cry. The chip is in control of his ability to cry. They just simply are not letting him. He cried once from being arrested and then brought into a room in a hospital with a bed, where they stuck him with needles to put him out. Earlier that day, he received the first and only audio recording ever sent from the girl he was in love with. This day and its consequences are going to be found later in the Iceberg. The other time was when he was lied to. He was told he could leave the mental health ward whenever he'd like. The staff retracted this and he was stuck in the ward for a week. When he heard this, he cried at the futility of his life and everything that's happened to him. Mental wards are further down the iceberg. He claims that the song is one of the best he's ever written, and that he may even perform it for me. One of Shurg's favorite ways to express written art is using the small form factor of traditional note cards. His first set of post-chip 12 note cards have some of his favorite writings on it. This is only on the tier because of the lost note cards. A total of 3 were given away, and another one was lost and never recovered. He marks these note cards as being very important to him. The end of this tier is Chipped Eyes Closed, and it might be one of the most long topics in the entire iceberg. It's very hard to explain. Shurg has explained it as lo-fi strobing, symbols, and patterns being created in a dark background. These appear when there's nothing else to stimulate the brain chemistry, but pictures, videos, and animations sometimes appear with stimuli added. First believed the drawings and animations were the creations of scientists and watchers. He now believes it's the brain chemistry of imagination being sent to him. What Shurg can see and feel seems to have unlimited potential. Most basic seeings and feelings Shurg has never had. This topic is so large we expanded it into later tiers. Thank you for watching Tier 2 of the Brain Chip Iceberg. The next tier is so long I might have to split it into 2 parts. Things will only get more interesting as the iceberg gets deeper. Thank you.